And when we spoke last week, you said something that really stood out to me. You said this is the culmination of your life's work. Can you expand on that for us?
Every time you say that, I get a little choked up. Because the truth of the matter is, I worked at the Women's Law Project in Philadelphia when I was 20 years old, 1989. I was on my way to law school to study international women's rights. I was so obsessed with this idea that women were so marginalized at that point. White women made 73 cents to the dollar, and women of color made less than 50 cents to the dollar. And when I decided to become an actor, I thought, okay, well, I'll have more, I liked it, and I'll have more chance to do good stuff in the world. Well, it took a long time. And I worked in diversity and inclusion, international women's rights, global women's rights for my entire life. I became a traveler, traveled all over the globe, connecting, collecting women's stories. That's how Sylvia and I became friends. We're both women's history buffs. And to finally see this on screen, the things that we had to go through to get this movie made, to get it properly funded and marketed and seen, was an uphill battle, to say the least. So for me to see this film is really incredible. It's a culture-shifting movie. I can tell you more about that later, and we're going to make many more of them.
Mm-hmm. We'll talk more about that. Sylvia, you know, as I mentioned earlier, you are a trailblazing journalist and was the first Black journalist on public radio in France. How did a question from your lovely daughter, Bettina, who joins us in the audience here, inspire you to go about your research and creating and writing your book, Reign d'Afrique?
Thank you. I must apologize for my English. I'm French. Well, I began my researches for my own curiosity to try to find a Black woman who left their mark in the history of Africa, because generally Black women are never presented in a role model in the history, the so-called universal history. They never appear, they never exist. And so I began my research, and one day my daughter, she was at that time 8 years old, and she just saw the movie Pocahontas about a young Native American princess. And when we came at home, she told me, a little puzzled, but why everywhere many people have famous woman. There is Pocahontas, there is Queen Victoria in UK, there is Joan of Arc in France, and there is Calamity Jane in USA. And we, what about us? Don't we exist before? And she wanted to, by people, black skinned people like us. And I was very troubled by that question, because as the 20th century, as the African continent is the most populated, most ancient populated continent in the world, and we have some children that think that Black people arrive after the rest of the humanity, because there are no tough history of Africa. It's brought me to try to make a book with all those researches I made for myself. And those researches took me 10 years in Arabic and Western documentation, but also in oral sources, because I was lucky to travel a lot as journalist in the African continent. And so it's why question of a child drove me to make that book.
Mm-hmm. And you gave us a great overview. And can you expand a little bit more about why it's imperative for more than just Black people to know history beyond slavery and colonialism?
Yes, because the history of Black people has never been translated by themselves. they colonized countries who colonized us and who made us in slavery, created our history and make it begin on slavery and colonization. But many people, even in the young generation, don't know what happened before that. And my book is the only one till now, and I was the only researcher to make that work, to try to bring people, general public, not only black but all over the world, to show that a part of humanity has its own history and has participated to the construction of the humanity. And it's important to have a more equality in the consideration of each other, we and the other people of the world, to know that history, to have a better consideration. Because even big companies who work with those countries have a false view of those people, of those countries, because they are ignorant of that history.
And speaking of that, I do want to touch on history. October is Black History Month here in the UK. And there was, there has been some criticism, over the accuracy of the film. And can you expand on what you just started talking about the lack of knowledge in this case?
As an historian, in my book, Queens of Africa and Heroine of the Black Diaspora, we present 25 portraits of women from antiquity to the beginning of the 20th century. I speak on Amazon of the former kingdom of Dahomey. And I was one of the specialists still alive of that subject. So I read many criticisms, but most of them are from people who ignore the real history. This movie is not a documentary, it's a fiction, but it's the first time I saw a film that respects as deeply as possible, respect a certain reality of a country, of people, of a society at that period of the history of the humanity. So most of those criticisms are not really accurate, but if people try to know more about that history, I think that they will be less emotional in their reaction.
Thank you for that. I want to talk about commercial viability, and we do have a poll, so if everyone can pull your phone out and scan the QR code on the right-hand side of the screen. And our question is, why are there so few female-led films? Is it mostly male studio heads, which greenlight projects, a lack of funding support for diverse creatives overall, or limited audience appeal of female-led movies? So if you could place your vote.
Interesting. Now is this working? Yeah. Okay.
All right, so let's see, we're tallying up here. Okay, so we're a little close. Okay, so right now, sort of pretty evenly split. So Maria, which one of these do you think is the biggest reason why?
All of it. And anyone in my industry who doesn't laugh at that graph, considering that we're a global market right now and that 50% of the world's population are women, more than 50% are the consumers of entertainment and media, we shouldn't even be asking that question anymore. Why are there so few female-led movies? There was one study that showed between 2007 and 2018, there were 4 female-led movies, action movies. Do you know how many male movies there were, action movies? 128. Half of those movies, more than half, tanked. They lost money. We, for many years, when I came up with this idea, thank God I had formidable, wonderful partners in Viola Davis and her husband, and I fought for years. I went to studios, to production companies, and they said there's no comps, which means financial comps, because there's never been a movie like this in the history of the world. When you say a historical drama set in Africa with all black women, they're like, I don't think so. That'll never make money. And I would say, look at Braveheart, look at Gladiator, look at Thor. You could go back through history of similar movies, but they all happen to star a white male. Now, Stacy Smith, who you might have met a few years ago, who was at the conference, all of her studies show people go to a movie because of the story, number one. It's not about a male or female lead. And now, is Hollywood making some strides? Yes. I'll tell you this, after Me Too, after the Black Lives Matter movement, little bits at a time, diversity and inclusion. But we got to the point where we were like, someone dared to offer us, okay, so Mel Gibson in 1993 got $73 million to make Braveheart. This is a very similar script, better, I think, and story. We were offered $5 million. Wow. So I'm saying the inequity in financing is a huge thing in my industry. And I don't even want to talk about the pay, because I'm sure you've already heard this, but my entire career, I've made about 30 cents to the dollar that a male in my position made. Women of color have made even less than that. So are things changing in Hollywood? Yes, they are. But most of the studio heads are still, and the gatekeepers, pretty homogenous.
Mm-hmm. The movie debuted at #1. It's now grossed nearly $60 million over the past 5 weeks. How important was it for it to be this successful? And does that mean we'll see more of these projects going forward?
I and a group of people tried to prove for years the business case. We would have all these conferences and roundtables, because there's some great people in Hollywood too who were like, how do we get more female films, more diversity, more... And you know what, in the end, we figured out it's a business case. It's a business. It needs to make money. You have to prove that it can make money. Well, do you know when Black Panther came out, Hollywood had no idea that was going to make money. Everyone was like, oh, I can't believe it. Why can't you believe it? There's no films like that. Diversity is humanity right now. We are very diverse cultures. We're, a global community now. So it's taken them a bit to catch on. Now, when The Woman King came out, yes, it needed to make money to prove it will double its budget, right? So, P.S., we got more than $5 million finally to make the movie. But female films traditionally, in a genre, get a budget of a third of what a male-driven movie gets. So all of these financial things, it had to be successful in order to show that people want to see these movies. And not only women have been going to this movie, men too. Like, I went to Braveheart and loved it. So to show that the commercial viability, we always say now, people talk about diversity and inclusion in our industry, and they're making little tiny steps with it. But what most people don't realize, and they're waking up to, is that diversity is the thing that sells. Diversity is profitability. And we're seeing that over and over again. So we have opportunities now to tell the 25 stories in Sylvia's book, and many more stories over the globe with our network.
Mm-hmm. So do you feel now that the term risky bet, when it comes to diverse cast, that it's risky to support those projects? We've had, Parasite, Squid Game, huge hits for Netflix. So are those exceptions to the rule or the new normal?
It's the new normal. But Hollywood always thought those ventures were risky. There were 2 movies this last year with male directors, and they tanked. They each lost $100 million. Okay? That's risky. It's risky that half of your movies in the studio that are very homogenous, that are based on white American, European, male sensibility, that they tank, right? They're losing money there. So what we're seeing is the greatest profits right now, particularly because it's becoming a global a global community, and that shows with Squid Games, that shows with Parasite. When I went to Hollywood a few years ago, I had a project that was a global project, right? People from all over the globe in it. And they said, well, audiences won't read subtitles. Audience only want to see, American, European stuff. Well, we've shaken that on its head as well. And we do want new stories from all over the globe. And that's the thing that really will connect us.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of which, your book, what are your plans? Are there plans to translate it into English, to turn some of these 25 stories that you've collected over the years into projects?
Yes, my deepest aim is to have this book translated in English because since 17 years, English-speaking people beg me every year to have this book translated in English. But in France, there was a great resistance because it's an overview of the history of Africa that the colonial history taught everywhere. And it's why my former publisher, French one, didn't want that English translation, but I've changed now. And I hope that I will be heard, and this book can bring many role models. Because speaking of women is speaking of society, speaking of a country, speaking of communities. Because women work daily to build the life of the country by educating new generation, by working in the economy, but they are invisible. And those women I present in my book also are wearing values that are universal, proud, the sense of freedom, and some of the values that we can find in every countries, in every people on the earth, But the only heroes I knew from my childhood till now are Western heroes. Those values are everywhere. It's why my contribution wants to change that and to make that in the mind of people all over the world that we share many things and we deserve to be heard also.
Mm-hmm. And speaking of that, you mentioned the funding challenges you had, with the Woman King. Can you elaborate a little bit on how you're working to decentralize financing and supporting more social justice content going forward?
Yes. I'm really excited to announce this new venture, this company. What we realized throughout the years is that companies now, you're doing it as well, you're starting to have divisions of inclusivity and diversity. We have built a company with incredible partners. I would say the female OG executive of my business who wrote the fucking playbook on diversity and inclusivity and proved, and over many years, this is the way the money is. This is where the money goes. So we have an incredible team of people that assembled quite quickly. We have women creators mining stories on 6 of the 7 continents. If anyone knows anyone from Antarctica, please let us know. It's the only country we don't have. And we have a few good men who are, again, formidable, older OGs in our business that have always hired women, that have always seen this, and that are like, okay, it's time. Market, global, money, let's go. So I'll be able to tell you more about it in the next month. We're going to be announcing it, but we don't have to worry in our company about doing classes on diversity and inclusion and incremental steps, because our entire company is built on those principles, and we would never, never go away from that.
All right, our final question. We always like to have a call to action. So Sylvia, what is something that our esteemed audience in the room and watching virtually, what is something they can do today?
Oh, to help us, to have much more stories like that, like the Woman King, but there is many other stories around the world, not only African or Black women, but as it's the first time, it's a first step with the Woman King, but we have so many models to show, and I would like that people can help us to bring, because literature and school don't show that history, don't show that heroism of Black women or other people who are heroic. And only cinema can do that, because it touches a very, very large public. And it's that role of education, and I hope that we can be help to make that work. Thank you.
Maria?
And speaking of profitability, this book needs to be translated into English. We need to have this book in English. There is no other book on African female heroes in history ever, and we need these stories. So if there's a publisher out there, give it. Come see me and Sylvia and Janine, our keeper of stories over there, our chief storyteller. Yeah, we're going to get this book published.